All through the month of June, we're going to be traveling through what's historically been known as the book of James. It's actually a letter that James, the brother of Jesus, wrote. Imagine that. You're the brother of Jesus, and now you're writing on behalf of Jesus. You saw this guy when he used to play with mud pies down by the river, and now you're saying he's your Lord. What would have to happen for you to decide that your brother was your Lord? For James, all it took was a little thing known as the resurrection. A little thing where Jesus predicted his own death and his own resurrection and pulled it off. Because when somebody can do that, well, you kind of got to listen to him, don't you? It'd be smart to listen to that person. So last week we kicked this off and we started looking through James's eyes at this letter that he sent out to some followers of Jesus who had kind of moved on out of the space that they had been in because of socioeconomic trouble, because of social upheaval that was taking place. We talked about how some of the followers of Jesus who had been in Jerusalem, where James had become a leader in the early church, had moved out because there was famine coming, there were grain shortages, there was social upheaval. This is the mid-40s of the first century. About 20 years later, there's a Jewish revolt against Roman imperialism. They don't like it. They don't want it. Things don't just happen like that, right? It's not just hey, we decided this week we're going to have an uprising. No, these things boil, right? They build over time. You look at the history of America and wars we've been in. These things, they build over time. We've been in the middle of a little bit of social upheaval here too, haven't we? There's been a little bit of tension in America over the last year, 2 years especially. Something I've never seen the likes of this much. I haven't been around that long. Some of you, maybe you've seen some other things, but this is more than I've ever seen in my life. And I can imagine, if it's like this for me, what it might have been like for the people in James's day as they're writing, as he's writing to them. He's trying to remind them how to still follow Jesus in a world full of social upheaval and tension and fighting and wars, where the rich take advantage of the oppressed and of the poor, and the poor have no recourse. Last week we said this: our trials can be triumphs if we can endure. Our trials become triumphs if we can endure. Remember, James is saying that to people who have had to flee out of Jerusalem, out of Judea, in search of food, opportunity, to get away from war and the nastiness that comes with it. James wrote a letter into the middle of that. So when he writes this letter, what I'm trying to get you to see is that there's some religious zealotry happening. It wasn't just in little pockets. It was all over the empire, and it was getting louder and louder, especially within Judea, especially right there in the city of Jerusalem, which is in Judea. He says, it's getting serious. I know y'all had to flee, but I want you to remember how to be a follower of Jesus in the middle of all of this. So we're picking up today. Here's what he says in chapter 1, verse 19 of his letter. He says, "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry." All right, so remember his audience, right? It's primarily poor people, a lot of them peasants who were not happy with the way things were going. About 100 years before James writes this letter, the Romans came in, a general named Pompey comes in, and he says, I'm cutting this up, I'm dividing all of this land up that used to belong to y'all, and now it belongs to the Roman Empire, and I'm cutting it up however I want to, and I'm only giving it to my friends. So people whose land had been in their family for generations could trace it back to the conquest of Canaan with Joshua. They lost their land, and they became peasants. And then they were often forced to work their very own land for the new rich landowner who took advantage of them and to oppress them. And so James writes and says, yeah, so when you get mad about that, no big deal. Don't say anything. James is a little bit nervous about them getting involved in any kind of nationalistic revolts. He doesn't want them getting involved in revolutionary activities. And he says, look, you need to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because speaking and anger often have a lot in common, right? They often go hand in hand at some point, don't they? When you get mad, you start talking, don't you? Start saying stuff you don't mean. Maybe you probably have never done this, but the rest of us in this room, and those watching online, we have all said something in anger that we wish we hadn't said. We've all done it. That's why James says, be slow to become angry. Well, how do you do that? Just a quick tip from a pastor is you learn to believe the best about other people. Some of us, we're naturally wired to be a little more cynical, and we think people are out to get us. But what if you decided to believe the best about others? You decided to see them as a creation of God, somebody who's not necessarily out to get you. And even if they were, that you're going to still try to believe the best about them in some way. Be slow to become angry, and then you'll be slow to speak. You'll also be quick to listen. These things all go together. And here's why he wants you to do this. Here's why. He says, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. All right? So righteousness is just a righteous way of living. We have maybe heard me say this before, that righteous was a legal standing. It's a legal standing before a judge. So if you went before a judge in the first century, in the Jewish world, they'd come before, both parties would come before, and the judge would hear both sides of the argument, and then whoever they were siding with would be deemed righteous. That was a legal standing. Because that's who God was righteous, did all things good. So, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. See, when we get worked up about stuff, we get worked up about these things that make us angry in some way. When we start running our mouth a little bit and we get whipped up into a fervor by other people who are gossiping and letting it go even further, it becomes this avalanche of anger and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. James is saying that human anger doesn't produce the righteousness that God desires. That's not going to produce the result that God wants from his people, James says. So the next time, we can kind of infer here, the next time James is wanting to say that somebody's sitting around complaining about the rich landowner who's oppressing and doing all these terrible things, and they're saying, we need to fight, we need to go and do something about this, we need to stand up against the Romans, and we need to start a war, and we need to do it. The next time they're doing that, be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Because following that path won't produce the righteousness that God desires. So he says all of this, and then he hits that big, momentous word. He says, therefore. So because of all the stuff I just said, therefore, get rid of all moral filth. I love that. Get rid of all moral filth. It sounds like my grandma talking to me, right? And the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. There's a lot going on right there, so let's talk about it. So, because of all the stuff I just said, I want you to understand this. Get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent. We look around, and it's not hard to find evil, is it? It's not hard to find evil around us in some way. You probably saw it driving here today or walking here today. If you're at home, hopefully you didn't see much evil there. All right, hopefully you didn't see too much moral filth there. We know what we're meaning, right? When we talk about moral filth and evil, we understand how prevalent it is. We understand that it is all around us. And we have this temptation as followers of Jesus to kind of dabble in it. You ever notice that? You see the people who want to follow Jesus, but they still want to keep their toe in the pool of moral filth. If I just do this, it's not that big a deal. Not that big a deal. I can just hang out over here a little bit with this. And that evil just creeps into your life and starts taking over. Next thing you know, you're acting in ways that you know you shouldn't act. You're doing things you know you shouldn't do. You're doing things that you know God would not and does not approve of. Things you wouldn't want anybody to know about. So James says, get rid of all of that stuff and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. Now the question becomes, what is that word? Is it like abracadabra? Excalibur? What is that word which can save you? Well, in order to see that, we have to look back at verse 18, right before where we started. James says this, he, talking about God, chose to give us birth through the word of truth, so that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. So the word of truth then is the gospel. It's the story of Jesus. It's the good news that Jesus has come into the world to save it, not to condemn it, but to save it and bring us back to God. So he chose to give us birth. That's that spiritual rebirth that Jesus talks about. You're a new creation, that we might be kind of first fruits. Now that threw me off a little bit when I first read it. But the idea is that we as the first fruits, followers of Jesus today, we're kind of a down payment, right? We're kind of like saying, here's what I've got to offer. Because one day this whole world is going to be set right. And you, as a follower of Jesus, I, as a follower of Jesus, I'm supposed to be an example of what is to come. You are supposed to be an example of what is to come. And sometimes, I don't know if I am. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about the Word, right? The Word that's been planted in us, the gospel of Jesus, that this world will be made right. And so he goes on in verse 22 and says this, do not merely listen to the Word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Do what it says. I remember every time I read this verse, I remember the King James version of it because there was an old man in my church growing up named Harold Siegler, and he loved this. He loved this because he'd say, I'm a doer of the word. Right? Be ye doers of the word. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourself. If you're hearing all of this stuff and you're listening to it and you think that it's sinking in, no. You're deceiving yourself. You're absolutely deceiving yourself. You have to do what it says. There's a connection here. You can't receive the word. You can't accept the word, as James is saying, just by listening to it. You have to do it. You have to be obedient to the word. You have to do what the word says. Now, this kind of flies in the face of how we've done things in America for a long time. We've just told people, hey, all you got to do is believe in your heart, right? Believe in your heart. Believe this thing, and that'll be enough. You can be saved, right? Because we don't want to border on telling people it's a works-based righteousness, right? We want to hold that tension between works and faith, right? The problem is, there's so many people who've grown up in churches just like this one, maybe churches just like you grew up in. There's people you maybe know, maybe you were one of these people at one point, maybe you still are, who thought, if I just intellectually assent to Jesus being the king, if I just intellectually go, yeah, I believe Jesus is the Son of God, the Christ, then that's enough. The problem with that is Jesus has a gnarly little quote about it. He says, yeah, even the demons believe that. It's not enough just to believe. You have to accept it. And the only way to accept it is to do what it says. And what is the gospel. The good news about Jesus. The things that Jesus taught. The things that Jesus said. James goes on, he says it this way. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in a mirror and, after looking at himself, goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. Right? So you got your mirror, you look at yourself, and, ooh, that's beautiful. And then you put it down and you forget what you look like instantly. So you pull it back up. Oh, yeah. Oh, I forgot again, right? Over and over. You're like that. You're like a person who forgets what you look like because your memory ain't working. It's not sinking in some way. He goes on. He kind of changes things up and gets a little different here. He changes up his similes. He said, but whoever looks intently into the perfect law. Remember, Jesus is the consummation of the law. He is the embodiment of the perfect law. Whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they have heard, but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. So the one who does what they're supposed to do, the one who hears from Jesus, hears the word, accepts it, right, listens, and then goes and does it, they're accepting it. They're people who don't forget what they have heard. They don't forget what they look like in the mirror. And then he says this that always sticks with me. Those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Because there is a direct correlation between your mouth and your level of anger. Between the things you say to other people when you're mad and the way they feel about themselves. Those things are all there. And James is saying, if you're going to follow Jesus, if you're going to accept this word, right, the gospel, if you're going to live it out and be obedient, then one of the best places for you to start is to live it out with your mouth. Otherwise, your religion is worthless. It's just you talking about stuff. He goes on and says it this way. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Now, I want you to notice there's two types of things going on here. All right, so first he said, look, if you can't keep a tight rein on your tongue, on your anger and how things come out, then the type of religion you have is basically worthless because it's not doing you any good. Nothing's changing for you. However, religion that God accepts that is not worthless, that's full of worth, is this: to look after orphans and widows and keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Two types of things going on, right? You've got socially oriented stuff where you're looking after others on the margins of society, the oppressed, the people who need help, and morally oriented things. You focusing on yourself, keeping yourself from being polluted, getting rid of the moral filth, abstaining from the evil around you. Look, here's the best way we can put all of this and sum all of this up from James. He says it this way: we accept Jesus when we obey Jesus. Now that's tough. That's tough because we're not advocating a works-based righteousness where I can do all the right things and check all the right boxes and then I'm saved. That's not what we're saying at all. However, on the other end of the spectrum, it is entirely possible to listen and hear all these good things about Jesus and smile and nod and believe all of those things, and yet you've never accepted Jesus. And that's not just coming from me. This comes from Jesus himself. Jesus replied in John 14, anyone who loves me will obey my teaching. My Father will love them, and we will come to them and make our home with them. So there's Jesus saying, if you love Jesus, right, you will obey his teaching. Anyone who does not love me will not obey my teaching. These words you hear are not my own. They belong to the Father who sent me. So there's obedience that's supposed to be involved in following Jesus. There's obedience that's necessary for following Jesus. You want to accept Jesus, you have to obey Jesus. The question, I think, then becomes, what did Jesus tell us to do? The first one's easy, right? Love God, love your neighbor. It says all of the law is summed up in that. Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. You got to love God, love your neighbor, and also love yourself. So that's looking after people like the widows and the orphans. It's spending time with God, loving God, appreciating God, worshiping God. They don't all have to look the same as everybody else's, but it's spending time with God and spending time with our neighbors, loving our neighbors, doing things for them, fighting for them if need be, right? Like making sure that our neighbors have groceries in their cupboard, fighting for the vulnerable of society. It means taking care of yourself too, taking time for self-care. But Jesus also says this at the end of his life. He says, "A new command I give you, that you love one another as I have loved you." So love each other like Jesus has loved you. Now, if these two things are central in your life, I think it's going to be natural for good stuff to kind of flow out of your life. I think it'll be more natural for good things to flow out of you. If you ever looked through Matthew chapter 25, Jesus tells a story. He tells a parable about the end of days and how at the end of days, God's going to take all the good people and the bad people and he's going to set them out and he's going to put the bad people over here, they're the goats. The good people over here, they're the sheep. Right? And what determines which side of the aisle you are on is how you responded in 6 things, right? You get to go be with the sheep, with the good people, the ones who get to enter into eternal bliss. If you have done things like feed the hungry, or given water to the thirsty, invited a stranger in, or clothed the naked, cared for the sick, or visited those in prison. Now, that's not an exhaustive list, but it's a snapshot of what happens in our life when these two things are true about us, when we're doing these things, when we're loving God, loving our neighbor, and loving each other like Jesus loved us. If we can do this stuff, those 6 things will flow naturally out of us, in addition to other things. We'll control our tongue. Why? Because I'm loving my neighbor. I'm loving them the way Jesus has loved me. We'll be slow to anger. Why? Because I'm loving my neighbor. My challenge to you is to let these things reign in your life. Let those things happen in your life. But my question to you today is this: are you obeying Jesus, or have you merely just accepted who he is on an intellectual level? Please, friends, obey Jesus by following these 2 commands. Let me pray with you. God, thank you for today, and thank you for this place that we can come together and just sing about you, talk about you, and call each other to obedience. I pray, help us to be obedient. Help us to be people who accept what you're doing in the world, who accept the good word about you, and let it flow out of us naturally, these good things. In Jesus' name, amen.